Right. Well, how do you keep track of this whole world that you have created? Timelines. It is very, you might, I actually do this even for my own books and my own series, but keep timelines. I am positive for Bridgerton, etc. She would have had to have kept very strict timelines of, well, if this character, if this younger character was at school, how old are they now in this book? How are time jumps and time manipulation and seasons changing? Diana Gabaldon, who wrote the Outlander books, must have had the most intricate timelines to keep track of, time jumps, who was in which part of the world going, back in time, etc. Family trees. This is particularly important if you're writing something like a Bridgerton, where you, and in fact, even in Hogwarts, in the Harry Potter universe, where it becomes quite important who's related to who. How is Snape connected to Harry's family? How is his godfather connected into this world? There's a lot of family connections, so you may very well need to create family trees for your characters. Maps is another great one, especially if you are writing a series like Virgin River, where it's set in a small fictional town that you've made up. You need to make sure that you can be consistent book after book after book. If you have written that a particular person lives on Main Street, you can't now have them living on a ranch outside of town 3 books later because you couldn't really remember. You've got to have maps of where everybody is in relation to one another. Where is the local bar? Where is the local shop? Where is the school? So that you can be consistent throughout your books. Spreadsheets. I have an editing client who also writes very similar to Bridgerton in the same time period, also a family-linked story. But she has actually created spreadsheets for each book and where each character, each of the siblings is at that current moment in that book, so that she can keep up to date. When she finally gets to that person's book, she's got their whole back history of what happened through the previous books already listed. However, and this is really the biggest point I'd like to make, do not get so sucked into the planning and the world building that you never write the actual story. It can be huge fun. My initial story, book that I started writing, probably 20 years ago, was set in Dark Ages and King Arthur times. And I had family trees because every version you read of King Arthur, there's a different family connection between the various characters. I had timelines, I had history and research, and I had created this entire world. I even had maps. But I spent probably 5 years building my world, and I only wrote 5 chapters. Naturally, that book has never been published. It's never been completed because I got so sucked into the planning and the world building that I never wrote the story. Maybe one day. But again, it's such a huge story that to go back and write it it's going to be a big feat. So the important thing is you do want to write the book. This is the entire point of being a writer, is to write the book and hopefully get it published. Right, so next steps. Ensure that the first story is complete within itself. So even if you have chosen to write a serial, make sure that Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone or The Hunger Games Book 1 can be a standalone book. Because that shouldn't be ales aren't strong. If sales aren't strong or the series isn't continued, you need readers to still feel like they had a satisfying reader experience. If they walk away feeling like, oh, well, now I never get the resolution to that. I mean, just think about how many TV shows you've watched that got cancelled and they'd ended the previous season on a cliffhanger. You walk away disappointed. Consider the series potential for every story you write. Look for ways to connect other stories if the first story sells. So again, if you have written a standalone book, have in the back of your mind how this could become a series later, so that just in case, no matter what book, even if you wrote a standalone, if this one really takes off and your publisher comes back to you and says, do you have more? Because we want to keep maximizing the earnings from this world you've created. Have you given yourself leeway to expand that universe? So while you're writing, consider creating interesting secondary characters or subplots that have the potential for more. Ideally, if you are going to write a standalone, you need to resolve the subplot so that the reader doesn't feel like you left a great big gaping plot hole in your story. But if you are planning on writing series, open up those subplots, hint at something. And then create your strong overarching plot line that connects all the stories. So Harry Potter, I'm pretty sure when she started writing the very first Harry Potter book, she already had to know that eventually Harry and Voldemort were going to have a showdown, and that everything else was just building to that along the way. The same thing with the Hunger Games. I'm pretty sure she knew when she created this universe and created President Snow as the villain, that she knew that eventually Katniss and President Snow were going to have their confrontation. Then you need to ask yourself, what is your series promise to your audience? Remember right back at the beginning, I said you need to decide what type of story and what style and what feel you're going to give. If this is a lighthearted, if this is a sci-fi, if this is a romance, if this is like The Witcher, what is your series promise? You cannot have book 1 be all dark and heavy and Witcher-like and then jump to book 2 and have it be a comedy. You have to lay in those comedy elements already in the beginning. You have to consider, what did you promise your audience or your readership in book 1 that you can follow through and recreate book after book after book? Because if you're jumping around from one type of book to the next, if you jump from now, for example, in Outlander, the connection was time travel. So she could jump from Scotland in the 17th century or 18th century, or whenever it was, to Virginia in the United States, to modern day. But you cannot jump from a sci-fi in one season to, for example, Battlestar Galactica to 17th century Scotland, because readers are going to feel like you've betrayed them, that you haven't lived up to the promise of your initial, and you will lose readers. Develop rising and falling action across the entire series. You don't want to have only rising action in the first book, only rising action in the second book, and then falling action in the last one. Each of those needs to have rising and falling action. And this is why writing a serial is so complicated, because within each book, you've got to have rising and falling action. And over the entire series or serial, you have to have rising and falling action. Whereas if you're writing in a series, each book is a standalone, so it doesn't really matter. As long as each book has its rising and falling action to give the reader the feeling of satisfaction when they read it, then you're good. So no matter whether you are writing series, serial, or for that matter, a standalone, ensure that every single book has a major climactic event. If there is no climax, readers will feel cheated. And give your audience payoffs along the line. So for example, in the Hunger Games, even though the final solution, the final resolution to this world and that the problems in this world are only achieved in the very final book, you have to give the audience payoffs along the way. They have to feel that there were successes, that there were victories. You have to have Katniss and Peter win the first Hunger Games. If they just ran away from the Hunger Games and went off and did something else, we're never going to get that sense of a payoff, of a victory. So give them what you promised in order to keep them coming back